Hello, welcome to our series on Windows in Advent, and today our text will be taken from 2 Samuel chapter 7. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. That's God's blessing on David. And this particular one will take us through days 9 and 10 of our Windows on Advent. Our story began back in the Garden of Eden. We met the snake. God had said there will be enmity, an ongoing struggle between your offspring and the offspring of the woman. We don't know when that took place. That's prehistory. 2000 BC, we came into the story of Abraham, the father of the Jewish race, and his grandson, who is Jacob. We met him, remember? And his twin brother Esau. God chooses the younger of the two twins to send this blessing, this promise through. And then we found when Jacob was blessing his sons, he blesses the fourth eldest, not the eldest of his children, but the fourth eldest, and he's Judah, and that's where the royal line is going to come. And we should have met the royal lion a couple of days ago, but we didn't. So there he is for today. And we're going to be beginning to start to look at how this prophecy will run through the line of David. So, how have we got to David? The last time we shared together, we were looking at the story of Moses, and Moses is about 1500, maybe 1300 BC, depending on which of the pharaohs you choose to link him to. So Abraham 2000 BC, Moses probably 1500 BC, and we then get into the story of David. He's around about 1000 to 960, maybe a little bit later than that, BC. And in between, after Moses, we get Joshua, who settles the land and defeats a number of people. We get the period of the judges, fourfold pattern occurring. The people turn their backs on God. Their enemies attack them. The people say sorry to God, and God rescues them. The last of these judges is Samuel, and he is the one who is going to introduce the line of the kings. And what we've got here in our story, we're moving towards a further covenant. Remember, God's cutting a couple of covenants with Abraham, a couple of agreements, a royal land grant and a suzerain vassal treaty, saying that God would be Abraham's master and Abraham would be his servant, a role of high value and merit and worth. Even the Lord Jesus himself continues to call himself a servant. We met another covenant with Moses, the Sinai covenant, the law, that again is a suzerain vassal, a master-servant treaty. And now with David, we're going to see that God is cutting a covenant with David and offering him an eternal royal line. I have made a covenant with my chosen one, says God in Psalm 89. And what's happened here is that the Jewish nation has said, we want a king like the other nations. Samuel has judged them well, but they reject Samuel. His sons aren't walking in his footsteps. And so they ask for a king like the other nations. And what they ask for is what they get. They get a king like the other nations. They don't get a king who has a real heart for God. In fact, there's no heart for God at all. So despite the fact that really God is their king and they live within a theocracy, they reject that and they get a venal king, a king who is self-centered, a king who turns away from God. And so in 1 Samuel 8 and 22, we read that God says to Samuel, make them a king. God isn't best pleased, and neither is Samuel, and tells them so, tells them what's going to happen. But the people insist on having this. And Saul is from the line of Benjamin. Now, if you recall, when Jacob passes a prophetic word on his sons, the royal line is going to come through Judah, not through Benjamin, the youngest of his sons. But Saul, son of Kish, Saul the tall, and Saul means tall, is from the line of Benjamin. So if we had had any foresight and we'd been around at that time, we probably would have realized that this wasn't God's long-term plan. There was help for the people, though, in choosing a king. They'd been given instructions by Moses back in Deuteronomy 17. And I'm going to read these verses to you. So I'll just put this here. And these were the rules. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of, and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. Well, God didn't really want Saul, but he chooses him as a temporary measure. He must be from among your own brothers. Yes, he is. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, but he does, or make the people return to Egypt, which he doesn't, to get more of them, for the Lord has told you you're not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives. Oh, we're in Solomon territory at this point, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Solomon. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he's to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law taken from that of the priests who are Levites. Saul never did that. It's to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So there were instructions laid out there for the appointing of a king, and Saul is appointed. And he doesn't do a very good job. God rejects him twice. He rejects him. So we join the story where God is sending Samuel, despite the fact that Saul is very much alive, over to Bethlehem, to the tribe of Judah, to appoint one of Jesse's sons as the new king. Now, Jesse is the grandson of Ruth and Boaz, so we're in a good line there. And in 1 Samuel 16 and 21, God says, I have provided for myself a king, as opposed to you make them a king. So God is directly involved in the choosing here. And this king has to be from Judah, which we found in Genesis 49. And also there was mentioned there Bethlehem, which links in, doesn't it, to the story of the Lord Jesus. God says about David, who is the son, the eighth son of Jesse and his wife, out in the fields looking after the sheep, and not even brought before them to check whether he's the one, that he is a man after his own heart. Even Samuel is deceived initially. He looks at Eliab and Abinadab, and he says, these look like tall people. They look like kings. But he was looking on the outside, and God looks at the heart. I'm going to find that again, when you go to Isaiah 53, and there's this talk of the suffering servant, and it's speaking of the Lord Jesus, and it's saying nobody would have picked him. Nobody would have thought that he was the one who was to do God's will. It's God's unlikely way, isn't it, of pursuing the prophecy. David is a man after God's own heart. How do we see this? Well, a number of ways, but particularly say in the way that he treats the Lord's anointed. Time and again he refuses to kill Saul, even though he has him at his mercy. Once in a cave there, and the king's gone in to relieve himself, he cuts off the end of the king's robe and holds it up, and he says, I could have done that. Or they go down into the camp, and again he could have killed the king, but he doesn't do so, because he recognizes that God has appointed Saul as the king. Later he looks after a son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth. He treats Saul's family well. And he's devoted to God. He's not devoted to the opinions of others. He's not someone who lives by the opinion of others. Remember when he brings the ark back, there's great joy. He sort of strips down to his ephod, which apparently is like sort of underwear. And he's dancing before the Lord with all his might, because he's so pleased to bring the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem. And his wife Michal despises him in her heart, and says, the king unrobed himself like one of the foolish fellows. And he says, well, God's chosen me and my family, not you and your family. And she is barren till the day that she dies. And so this promise of the offspring, the seed, doesn't come from Michal. Otherwise it would come, in a sense, from Saul's house. It comes from another woman, Bathsheba. See, David, although he's a man after God's own heart, he's not perfect by any means. We find he loses his temper with Nabal out when he's an outlaw, and he's about to go and wipe him all out, and Abigail comes and says, don't do that. He says, very wise. And here, with Bathsheba, another sordid tale where he basically takes Uriah the Hittite's wife, he sleeps with her, she has a baby that dies, but later, after David has married her, they have Solomon, and Solomon is going to be in the royal line. Again, God doing things in a strange way. And then later, of course, he makes a very big mistake by taking a census of the fighting men, as though he's saying, let's see how powerful I am. But each time he repents, and we find him in Psalm 51 declaring that this particular psalm is to be sung about the king's grief, about the king's, not grief, I'm sorry, but the king's sin, king's sin. And he says, I sinned, and he has it sung in public. Let's leave the story there for the moment. So, until we meet again tomorrow, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you and give you his peace at this Advent season.